Şimdi Inbound, Angek gibi uluslararası konferanslarda konuşmuş ve The Drum tarafından 50 dijital kadın arasında seçilmiş. Laura'yı size takdim etmek istiyorum. Laura içerik pazarlaması stratejileri sunumuyla bizle olacak. Now I would like to introduce Laura with her content marketing strategies presentation.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first time in Istanbul, and so far it definitely doesn't disappoint. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm Laura. I run a PR and content marketing agency back in the UK. I started my own agency this year, but before that I worked at a big SEO agency in the UK running the PR department. So I've had quite a lot of experience with running PR content marketing campaigns, and some go really well and we get amazing results, and then you always have those ones where you expected them to do a lot better than they actually do. And I've always been quite one for analysis and working out, how can we do better? How can we improve? So I do a lot of analysis, and I also talk to a lot of journalists, and they're more than happy to share their frustrations with us and how much PR people annoy them. So that's kind of what I've taken to put together the presentation that I'm doing today. Hopefully to avoid you making any of the mistakes and kind of creating the kind of campaign that does work. So I called it the Successful Campaign Blueprint, but essentially that's what I'm going to be covering, is how to run a campaign that does work and is successful. So in PR and content marketing, unfortunately, there's no guarantees. As much as all my clients would love me to be able to guarantee exactly what the results are going to be and exactly who's going to cover the campaign, that's not something that we can actually offer because there's a lot of variables involved. However, what I've learned is that there are certain things that make a campaign more likely to succeed, and they're the things that I think are important to focus on. And what I mean by that, there's certain questions that journalists, when we email them or phone them to pitch our story, there's certain questions that kind of automatically in their head, they're kind of running through and ticking off when deciding whether to write about the story that we're sending them. So I find that if you've considered all of those questions before you even, pick up the phone to pitch them or write out the email pitch, you're much more likely to create a successful campaign. And all of us want successful campaigns, right? So that's kind of what I'm going to go through in order. So first of all, timing. So the journalist is asking themselves, why should I write about this now? So what's special? Why is it newsworthy? And there's different ways you could demonstrate why it should be now. So for example, an obvious one is if this is a new product or service that you are launching, or your client is launching if you're agency side, well, that's a really good reason to write about it right now, because there's no point writing about it, a week after it launched or a month after it launched. But we're not all launching products and services every time we want to get links or get coverage. So what else makes them write about it right now? Event tie-ins can work really well as well. And I kind of say events because it doesn't have to be like an actual physical event that people go to. More like an event in the calendar. So for example, a public holiday, so you have Republic Day here this month. That's an event that you could tie something into. There's various national days that we have, so there's lots of worldwide ones, and then there's lots of kind of country-specific ones. So a few weeks ago, we had World Mental Health Day. So again, that's kind of an event that we can tie a campaign into. And then there's also cultural events, and by that I mean kind of a broad spectrum rather. So it could be a sporting event. So for example, the Super Bowl is something that we could tie something into. Or it could be an entertainment event. So I don't know, the MTV Movie Awards. There's lots of different types of cultural events that we can also tie into. Or things like anniversaries. So I think there's the anniversary of the Bosphorus Bridge being built. For example, that's an anniversary that we could tie things into. And there's lots of resources to go to find out when these events are happening. But that's another reason for a journalist to write about it right now, because if it's Republic Day or World Mental Health Day, again, there's no point in writing about that a week after it happened. So it gives them that reason to write about it right now. There's also Newsjacking, so that's kind of proactive planning for events. We do a lot of what we call Newsjacking, which is whereby we look at what's going on in the news, so what's high on the news agenda, and we'll do something to react to that, which is another reason. So say if something's trending, that's a reason for the journalist to write about it right now, because again, if something's trending, it trends for what, 24, 48 hours max these days? You've not got that long. So again, it's a reason for them to write about it right now, otherwise it's old news. And there's lots of different things that you could be reacting to. It's just a case of checking what's going on in the news that might be relevant for you or your client, again, if you're agency side. So that's the timing. Next is credibility. So the question the journalist's asking is, what makes the brand credible on the subject? Because that's really important. They're not going to write about you if they don't believe what you're saying. And sometimes that can be inherently obvious. So sometimes it just makes sense for your brand. So a client that we have, they do conference calling and communication software. But they found that they had a big problem with how conference calling was normally done. So the usual approach, which you may have used yourself, is whereby you have a conference calling PIN number. So you all have the same phone number that you dial in, you use the PIN number, and that's how you get onto the conference call you're meant to be on and speak to the right people. The problem they found with that, and I've actually found this myself from doing lots of conference calls, is people share PINs. So like with your colleague might also use your conference call PIN, but then if you've set one up at the same time, you kind of get the wrong people dialing in and ending up on calls, and you have that awkward situation where you have to explain that you shouldn't be on this call. And we found that a lot of people did that. So they created the way their conference calling works is through an app where the conference call organizer dials out specifically to the right people and can see everyone that's on the call, how long they've been on the call, what they're doing. So you always know exactly who's listening to the conversation that you're happening. So it's a lot more secure, because a lot of people talk about confidential information on conference calls. You don't want the whole world listening. So that's really important. Security was really important for them for their product. So we did a campaign for them which was looking at security in the workplace, which looked at things like how many people had experienced a stranger on their conference call, someone who shouldn't be there. It also looked at, so we this year had the GDPR regulations come into place, all around data protection. And it looked at, since then, how many people have actually been trained on GDPR that handle customer data. So lots of different kind of things touching on security. Now, they're inherently credible on that because they've created a whole product and service targeted around security in the workplace. So from a journalist's point of view, it makes sense because that's literally what they do. So that's the inherently obvious, but sometimes you'll want to run a campaign and it might not be as easy link as that. So sometimes, So sometimes you may need to borrow someone else's credibility. Because it's not to say you can't run a campaign if it's not obvious why you're credible, but there needs to be some credible element within that. So here's another example. So I used to work with a company called Confused.com, who in the UK, they're a price comparison website. So for example, when your car insurance is up for renewal, you go on there and get your quotes from all different people. And car insurance and all their motor products are very high value for them. So they wanted us to do something around driving and cars specifically. But a lot's been done around that. Like it's quite a saturated subject. But what we came up with was this idea of, so people talk a lot about driving under the influence of alcohol or under the influence of drugs. We know that that's illegal. You can't do that. We know that it affects you. But we started thinking about, well, what else affects your driving performance? And we wondered how emotions did, because emotions can be just as powerful as alcohol or drugs or other things. You know, when you're angry, you probably know this, when you're angry, you're not always thinking straight. And like, if you've had an argument with someone just before you go to drive, like I know if I have an argument with someone, for like a good half an hour afterwards, I'm replaying it and thinking about a better comeback that I could have made to the argument. So we thought about that and thought, how do we measure the impact of emotions and driving? Because although Confused.com are kind of experts in driving as a whole, they don't have any credibility in the emotional aspect. So we worked with an expert, we worked with a psychologist who was able to say, well, this is the impact that anger has. So from a physiological point of view, the fact that adrenaline is released into your body because you're angry, but then also what does adrenaline do to you? Like, how does it affect your response times, which would also then impact your driving? So we created this asset that took you through like essentially how emotions affected your driving or potentially affected your driving, which worked really well, but we were kind of borrowing the credibility of the psychologist on that. She was the expert that made the campaign work. So you need to establish the credibility, whether it's your own inherent credibility or whether you get someone on board that offers that credibility. You have to make sure it's established. And try and make sure it's easily established so the journalist isn't trying to confirm it themselves. The next thing is relevance. So we've kind of gone through with credibility. It's also why it's relevant to the company, so to the brand that you're promoting. But you also need to think, so the journalist is thinking, well, why is it relevant to me? You know, why have you contacted me with this? And this is one of the big things that journalists get annoyed about, is being contacted with irrelevant campaigns. So you need to establish this again. You need to show them why they should care about the thing that you're pitching. Why does it matter to them specifically? So you can think about, is there a certain column that they write that it fits into? So say if you're doing something finance and they do a personal finance advice column, well, that's an easy fit. That makes total sense that they should care about that and that it's relevant to them. So think about that. Think about any columns or sections of a paper, magazine, whatever it is that they write for. Or have they written about the specific topic before? So I mentioned we did that security report and we had an element that touched on GDPR. Well, we could easily find all the journalists that have been writing about GDPR because they're clearly following that conversation, and we can get in touch with them about our campaign. And it's clearly relevant because they wrote about it before. They care about that matter. It could be that it's a personal interest of theirs, which still makes it relevant. So if we're doing something that's especially more around like cultural events and like entertainment or sport, if we can see by looking at, say, their Twitter or Instagram or whatever it might be, that they also like that TV show, or they follow that sports team, or that sport generally, again, that's a reason that they would be interested. That's a reason that they would care in what we've created. And a news tip is a useful tool for finding this out. So you can find out people that, journalists specifically, that have tweeted about a certain subject or written about a certain subject, which is what these two screenshots are showing. So I think we were looking at like data breaches here, because that's similar to the campaign I was talking about around security. So here are journalists and publications that have written or tweeted about a data breach. So anything that we have on data breaches would be relevant to them. We can see that they have an interest in it, and we can demonstrate that. If none of the above applies, so if you can't see which column it fits into, if you can't see that they've written about the topic before, or that it's even a personal interest, so something that they've tweeted about or spoken about, you need to ask yourself, well, should I really be contacting them? Because the chances are you might actually just annoy them if it's not relevant. And if you can't figure out why it's relevant, they're not going to do the work for you. They're not going to read your email and then start thinking about how it actually applies to what they do. They're just going to ignore it. So it's a waste of time. What can be really useful when you're trying to establish that relevance is if there is a particular column or a particular section of the website that you see it fitting in, outline that. So you can say, I think this would be a really great piece for your personal finance column, or whatever it might be. That makes it even easier for them. And I know a lot of journalists, they tend to do this. So if they write a weekly or a monthly column, they'll just search in their inbox at the time that they have to write that column for anything that mentions the column, because they should be all the relevant stories that they should include. So that's really easy for you to make sure you're seen at the time that they're writing about the article. They might not to respond to you when you send the email, but they will when they're writing about that subject. The next thing is emotional response, which I think is often forgotten, but it's important. How does this story make me feel? So if we've already established relevance, we still need to think about, but how do I feel about it? You may have seen this before, so this is Maya Angelou, and it's a really important quote, I think, that we should all remember. So she says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's true. If you think about when you meet people, when you remember them, or when you think about them, it generally is because of how they made you feel, whether you actually want to see or talk to that person again, or whether actually you'd rather avoid them for the rest of your life. And it also dictates whether you're likely to talk about that person to someone else. So if someone was really nice to me and made me feel really happy, I'm much more likely to tell someone else about that. And it applies to content as well. If content makes me feel a certain way, I'm more likely to share it, and I'm more likely to be interested if I'm a journalist in writing about it. So the media has this saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's what it stems from. It stems from emotion. So whenever you watch the news on TV or hear it on the radio, or if you look at a front page, the top stories are the ones that will prompt an emotional reaction. It's the reason that anything war-related always gets covered, because it tugs at your emotions. If it bleeds, it leads is all about emotional response. So if you want to get good coverage, you need to be tapping into that. And there's a range of emotions. So this is taken from Psychology Today's kind of wheel of emotions, and we've got these kind of core emotions, and then it kind of spans out into other ones as well. So there's all these different ones that we can tap into. And it can be quite hard to think, okay, well, do I just need to stimulate an emotion, or does it matter which one? And there's a great book I read called Contagious. And if you're interested in shareable content and generating coverage, I'd highly recommend it. But in there, Jonah covers how different emotions stimulate a response. And basically, so high arousal means you're more likely to take action as a result. That's the definition of arousal. It prompts you to do something. So high arousal means you're likely to share, you're likely to write about it, you're likely to do something. Low arousal means that you're not likely to. And then we've also got this kind of positive or negative emotion, because you might think that you need to make people happy to make them want to do something. Well, actually, the reverse is true as well. If you make someone really angry, that also prompts them to do something. And I'm not suggesting that you make people angry necessarily at your brand or your client, but if you can tap into a subject that they will feel passionate about and perhaps show some injustice in the world that you're highlighting that will rile people up but kind of behind you, well, that's going to work really well. So you need to consider this. And this is a quote from Jonah. So rather than harping on features or facts, we need to focus on feelings, the underlying emotions that motivate people to action. And I think this does really apply to journalists. If we want a journalist to actually care enough to write a story about what we're pitching them, we need to know that they care. We need to make them care. We need to make them feel something about it. So really think about when you're coming up with your campaign ideas and deciding what story to pitch. Think about how it made you feel when you heard about it and when you were coming up with the idea. So I often call this the pub test as well. I'm from the UK, we love a pub, we go there all the time. It's where we see our friends. But I noticed that sometimes my friends that didn't even work in the same industry would start talking about something. And it was interesting because what they were talking about, I knew was a PR campaign or a marketing campaign, but they didn't. It just prompted a reaction from them. And that's kind of what we're going for. So if you can think about a campaign and say you suggest it in the office, if it gets people talking, if it's that kind of one where you're like, how about this? And then someone's like, yeah, because that always happens, and then this, and then I've seen this. And you get all these people jumping in with responses, you can tell that that's likely to be successful because clearly people have an opinion on it, people have a feeling around it, and that's what we want. We want it to be the kind of topic that people keep talking about. If you suggest an idea, say in the brainstorm for the campaign or just back to the team, and it's kind of that like, oh yeah, that could work, cool, we'll go with that, chances are that won't work. And they're probably just saying it to be nice because they don't want to offend you. If it doesn't stimulate conversation, if it doesn't stimulate a proper response from people, it probably won't be successful. The next thing is human interest, which I think is closely related to the emotional point, but it's kind of separate. And the question the journalist is asking themselves is, who does this affect? So the story that you're pitching me, who cares? Who's going to be affected by that? And the easiest way to demonstrate this is through case studies. You need to show the human impact of the story that you're pitching. So I did a campaign that was based around overcoming things at work. And we wanted to talk about kind of the diverse range of issues that all of us face in our working lives and how they overcome them. And that was really easy to show the human impact. Like, we could have pulled stats. So we could have had data on, X% of people have suffered from mental health issues. X% of people have had a miscarriage and then gone back to work. X% of people have cancer and relate to work. Like, technically, those stats relate to people. It's the people that have had cancer. It's the people that have had a miscarriage. But you're missing that human element of who's behind that story. So what we did instead of that is we got case studies of people that had overcome these issues. So we had, it was one of the first openly gay rugby players in the UK. He talked about overcoming homophobia in his workplace. And his workplace is very different to my workplace and probably your workplace. His workplace was a group of guys in a locker room, which is very intense. But then we also had working mums talking about things like overcoming sexism or overcoming the fact that they had a miscarriage and then had to return to work. And when it's a person, when it's a case study, the person that's been through it, telling that story, it helps to stimulate that emotional response. You feel more connected to another human than you do to a stat. And it's so clear who it's affecting. Like, you can see their photo, you can see the person, you can see the video of them talking about it. So establishing that is really important as well, because although, like I said, we could have told the story through data, it wouldn't have had the same impact. It wouldn't have made people care as much as seeing the people behind it, seeing the people that have been affected. So where you can, use case studies, really hammer that home. Here are the people. And it doesn't have to be negative. So they were quite sad stories with happy endings because they overcame it and they were very successful in their careers. But it's that kind of negative emotion. But you can do the same with positive. So, here's how we're helping people. Here's this product that we've created and we've saved people, this money, or we've helped them to do this. You can use positive stories as well, but you need to be showing who it is, like who's at stake here. The next thing is shareability, and this is more of a recent-ish one. So I think a lot of the topics that I've just talked about have always applied in journalism, whereas shareability is only really relevant now that we have social media. But this is, so the journalist is thinking, will it generate shares and engagement? Because although it might not seem like something a journalist necessarily has to think about, they do. So this was a study done with journalists, and it was looking at whether they consider shareability when writing a story or deciding whether to write a story. More than 41% overall said that they consider it. So, nearly half are considering this, which is quite important. And then more than that actually track how well each of their stories does on social media. And I think these two stats are important for different reasons. One, if nearly half of journalists are thinking about how shareable a story is, we need to make sure we think our story actually is shareable. And if we've thought about the human interest and the emotional element, we should have kind of covered that off, so it should be. But we need to consider that, and again, if there's a subtle way to highlight that, that's not going to do you any harm. But equally, if even more are tracking how many times their stories are shared on social media, share the story. Help them out with that. Because if they write a story for you, so if they cover the story that you pitch, and they publish that, and they're tracking how popular it is, if your story is really popular and gets shared a lot, the next time you pitch them a story, they're much more likely to cover it because they know that last time they covered something you sent them, they got a lot of shares, and that was really good for them. And we found this with, just getting the client to share it for us, but also getting the team to share it. If you think about how many people you have in your team or the teams you work with, you can start the ball rolling there. And then how many people they have following them, it starts to grow. So make sure you at least start sharing the coverage yourself, because at least that shows willing to the journalist and shows that you've thought about how they operate and what they're concerned with, and that will help you with your next pitch. What's also important is thinking about the world of social media and whether something's shareable. You've got a character limit. So you can't make your campaign so complex that it can't be explained in 280 characters. Because if you can't explain it in 280 characters, a tweet, and remember that used to be 140, but if it can't be explained in that to make someone want to click on it and read more, then it's probably not going to be successful again, because we live in a world of where we consume is through social channels a lot of the time. It needs to be short enough to capture our attention. So brevity is key. Keep it concise and do that with your pitch to the journalist so that they can see, if you're able to explain it to them in your pitch email in a really short way, then they know they'll be able to share it in the same way. So really think about that and think about how long your initial pitch is. Next up is visuals. So are there any accompanying visuals is essentially the question a journalist is asking themselves. If all you've sent them is some form of text, probably not going to work, because when's the last time you saw a news story that didn't have at least an accompanying image? I'm going to guess you haven't seen one any time, recently. Because they do, just all stories have to have visuals. That's how it works. There's a bit of a delay. But there's some things to consider in terms of the visuals. So first of all, how you share the visuals. So journalists receive a lot of emails. That means it takes up a lot of space in their inbox. So what you don't want to do is attach really high-res images that will clog up their inbox. That's a really easy way to piss a journalist off straight away. And also, a lot of them have thresholds so that if it's over a certain file limit, it just won't even get through to them. They won't even receive your email. So think about how you share them. Maybe use Dropbox or WeTransfer or some kind of file transfer service like that. But then when you're doing that, you need to make sure you describe what the images are. So this is another frustration a lot of journalists talk about, is the fact that someone will say, here's the link to the accompanying visuals or photos. Well, that's not that helpful because they then have to click on the link to download them to even find out if they want that kind of photo. So explain what you have photos of or what the visuals are so that they can then decide whether they want to download them. And also think about the publication or the website that you're pitching. So if it's online only, they don't need super high-res images because what they're going to have to do is convert them to make them web ready. And that's another step a journalist has to take that they don't want to take, that you need to make their life as easy as possible. If they're web only, the publication, just send them the right file for web. Don't send them super high res. But equally, if there's something that also has a print version, do make high-res ones available because they will need them if they're going to print. So make sure you provide both options. Consider what they're actually going to need to do their job. And just one more thing on visuals. When I talk about visuals, I don't necessarily just mean photos. So this is looking at what percentage of these publications online, what percentage of their content is video. And you can see there's a huge difference between, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, I would not do it justice, and it would be very embarrassing for me. Hopefully you know these publications. But yeah, just 2%, which I believe is maybe more a traditional kind of newspaper, and then some other ones. But you can see over here, it's really high. Nearly every article that they publish has video content. So if you want to increase your chances of getting coverage and getting talked about on that publication, send them some video content. Include that with your campaign, because you know that they want it. And do this research for the sites that you're targeting. So it might be that these aren't the ones that you care about. But have a look at this for the ones that you do. So the way I do this is a simple search in Google. So if you look at the site, look at how many index pages there are overall, and then look at how many index pages contain video. And that gives you a good indication, because most articles are written in a very similar way where it'll say, watch the video below. So you know there's a video there. But do this, and don't necessarily just do it with video. You could look at other visual mediums as well. But this is just to show you, like, don't just think static, because journalists aren't. So they're kind of the questions that a lot of journalists are going through when they're kind of evaluating your pitch and deciding, am I going to cover this? And I'm not suggesting that you explicitly answer those questions in your email or on the phone. I'm not suggesting you go through that as a checklist and explain why it's good for them. But what I am suggesting is that you consider it yourself for every campaign that you create. Because if you've considered it, it should be apparent to the journalist that you have. There are some things, like I said, so if there is a particular column or section, I would suggest outlining that, because that's making their life easy. But I wouldn't necessarily go through everything, just consider it yourself. So almost use this as an internal checklist for your campaigns, and think, have we got visuals? Have we got this? Have we got that? And I thought I'd just include some extra pitch tips. So that was kind of in terms of when you're creating your campaigns, what you should think about, because they are a lot of the frustrations for journalists. But journalists also get very frustrated just by the pitch email. So even if you've considered all of the above, if your pitch is bad, you're still not going to get the coverage. You're still not going to get the cut through. So I thought I'd just run through some of this as well, really quick before I finish. When I talk about how frustrated journalists are, this is a search for journalist frustrations with PRs. 210,000 results. So like, we really annoy them, and they're very vocal about it. So I've kind of looked through these and gone through my experience with journalists to put these tips together. First of all, easiest one, use their name. Like, how hard is that? You should have researched them. You should at least know their name. Use it. Do not just say hi there. Do not just say hi or dear sir or whatever you might be thinking of putting. Put their name. Otherwise, they're instantly not going to be interested in what you've got to say. And it's surprising, apparently, the amount of PRs that don't use the journalist's name. So that's the easiest tip you can have. Next, don't be too friendly or over-familiar. So you don't have to be super formal in your email, but also You don't need to be too friendly. So some of the journalists were talking about how people will inquire about like their pets, or they'll have seen on Twitter something that they did at the weekend and be like, how did you enjoy your trip to so-and-so? Like, that's just a bit creepy. Like, that's taking stalking a bit too far. So use the name, be friendly, but not too friendly. Keep it keep it professional to a certain level. Don't send PDF press releases. So a lot of what I've covered is around making life as easy as possible for journalists. A PDF press release is not easy. They cannot copy and paste. You're going to annoy them. Don't do that. What you should do is it's usually best just to paste it in the email. So we'll kind of do our pitch and then just say the press release is below, because then they don't even have to download and open an attachment. It's just there. They can copy it if they want to. Make it easy for them. Get to the point. So I already talked about how important it is to be able to explain the campaign within 280 characters. It's also important to get to the point in the email. If you send them an essay, they're not going to read through it all to decide whether they want to cover it. So answer these questions right at the start, kind of first sentence, explain who it's about, what it is, where it's happening, when it's happening, and why they care, why it's happening. Make sure you get to the point and do all of this right up front, first thing you say. Curb hyperbole, so not everything is awesome. Not everything is the most amazing thing that's ever happened in the world. And as much as it might be important to you, and it might be important to your client, it's not the best thing the journalist has ever seen. And too many people use this. Too many people really amp up why it's so cool what they've done. And again, that just puts journalists off. They receive loads of stuff every day. You don't need to really ramp that up. If you are going to use data, ensure your data is sound. So a lot of journalists said that they've had pictures and they've got interested in the story, and then they'll question something about the data, and it turns out it's not reliable, it's not sound data. Or when you've analyzed it, you've kind of messed something up. Really check that, make sure it's sound, because they're going to be even more annoyed if they get to the point where they want to cover the story, and they can't because you messed up the data. So make sure you check it. Make sure everything you've included is like triple checked. I've gone too far. Make your contact details clear. So if they want more information, they need to know really easily how they get that information. So email address, phone number, make sure it's there. And then make sure you're available. So there's nothing worse than, again, if you get a journalist interested in your story and then they try and call you and you don't answer, that's going to annoy them as well and turn them off. And I'm not suggesting that you have to be available 24/7 necessarily, but at least put with your contact details, these are the times and dates that I'm available. Just outline that. Make it easy. Make sure they can get hold of you if they want to run your story. Proofread everything. So let's not forget, a journalist writes for a living. Their spelling and grammar is perfect, and they judge you if yours is not. So make sure you read it. Make sure you get someone else to check your press release. Like, triple check everything, because there's nothing worse than poor spelling and grammar is another reason that a journalist will just discount your story. Because also, don't forget what I said, a lot of journalists want to be able to copy and paste the press release. If your press release is littered with spelling and grammar mistakes, they can't just copy and paste it. They have to go through and edit it themselves. And if they're feeling particularly lazy that day, or they're in a bad mood where they want to get annoyed about something, your story is going to be the one that goes out. They're not going to do that. So make sure you proofread absolutely everything. Another thing that PRs tend to do is this kind of endless follow-up. So you send the pitch email or you make the initial call, and then you don't get the coverage. So you send another email, like, hey, just checking you got my email. Are you interested in my story? And you still don't hear back. And then you send another one like, hey, I just wanted to know if you were interested in using that. That's a surefire way to just annoy a journalist. So like maybe send one follow-up, Or if suddenly you've got something else that supports the story that you didn't send straight like the first time, send that. But don't just keep sending email after email, phone call after phone call. If they didn't get back to you the second time, they're not going to get back to you the fifth time, for sure. And this is taken from a survey with journalists, which is them detailing what they actually want from PRs, just to kind of wrap up, which is a lot of the stuff that I've already talked about. So researching and understanding their media outlet, which is what I was saying. So highlight why it's relevant to them and the title they write for. Do that research. Provide them with the data, so I talked about that, and the expert sources. So the credible person, whether it's your client, you, or whether it's someone you've brought into the campaign, provide them with the access to them. And when they need it, that's around the availability. Have contact details, be available. Tailor the pitch to suit their beat and coverage. So tailor it in terms of explaining why it's relevant to them. So is it of geographical relevance? Do they write for a regional paper and you have data specifically for that area? Or do they write on a certain topic area and it's really relevant to that topic area? Stop spamming me is kind of an obvious one. But that's a lot around like the follow-up. So like stop sending endless emails that they're not interested in, because that's just going to put them off ever covering a story that you might have had that would be interesting. So don't send endless emails. And include multimedia assets. So coming back to the visuals, they're saying multimedia. They're not just saying send me photos, they're saying multimedia. So what I was saying about video, really relevant. They want to cover that kind of stuff. So then in summary, these are essentially the questions that I think you should be considering when you're putting your campaign plans together. So why now? Why would a journalist write about it right now? Why is it relevant right now? Why is it newsworthy? Why you? So why is it about your brand? What makes it relevant to you? Why are you credible on the subject of this story? Why me? Like, why do you think me as the journalist would want to write about this topic? Why would I care? Who's affected? Who's the human interest element? Who are the people that we should be seeing and feeling for? And what should I feel? So should I feel happy about the story? Should it anger me? Should I feel sad? How should I feel? I have to feel something. Is it shareable? Do we think that people would engage with it on Facebook or on Twitter? Can I write about it in a short enough way to get the point across that people would actually click on the article and come through to read it? And then how is it visualized? So is it photos? Is it an infographic? Is it an interactive asset? Do you have a video? Make sure you've thought about and answered all these questions yourself before you create your campaign and before you send your pitch. And hopefully by doing that, you should have more success in your campaigns. I know I do. And that's essentially what we all want, right? To do better, to get better results, which is what this should help you to do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So it was totally eye-opening presentation for us. Especially context was amazing, but also the design was very good, actually.
Thank you.
So we do have one question for you, actually. So,
okay.
One of our attendees just asked this. He asked, what would you suggest for the beginners? I mean, what kind of cooperation they can have with PR agencies with a low budget, for example?
There's lots of stuff. So not everything has to be really expensive. Often it's the visual element that really adds up the cost. So even though I said video is really popular, if you don't have the budget to do video, like don't do video. Yeah. I think doing the things that I just went through isn't necessarily costly. The most important thing is relevance. So relevance to your company and relevance to the journalist. A news tip, which is the tool that I showed up there. Yeah, exactly. That's a free tool. Like it's freemium in that you can pay, but you can use it for free. So just use that to find out what journalists are writing about at the publications that are relevant for your brand, and just pitch them something relevant to that. That's a really good starting point. Yeah. And be really personalized with it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should check your tips very well. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.